The Bradshaw Library and University Archives Special Collection fundraising efforts have been significantly impacted due to the COVID crisis. Please use the donation link in the chat box to visit our giving page if you would like to support the archives. When making a contribution, please be sure to select Archives and Special Collections as your designation. We thank you so much for your support. Contributions from the community make it possible for the archives to bring free events like this to our students and the public at large. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter for this evening, Dr. Elizabeth Bouldin. Elizabeth Bouldin is an associate professor of history at WGCU, where she teaches courses in European and Atlantic world history. She is the author of Women, Prophets, and Radical Protestantism, and she is currently working on a new book on Quaker women educators in the Age of Enlightenment. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bouldin.
Hello, and welcome to Cultivators of Knowledge, Women and the Study of Botany, circa 1650 to 1850. I'd like to thank Melissa Vanderberg and Bailey Rogers for the invitation to speak tonight, and to congratulate everyone at WGCU Archives for their work in creating this informative and amazing exhibit. I will be returning regularly, if only to see the changing selection of beautiful orchids on the orchid wall, and I hope that many of you all will also have the opportunity to visit. I have a slide at the end with a little bit more information about the exhibit and WGCU Archives. In 1766, a French woman named Jeanne Barré disguised herself as a man, accompanying her partner Philibert Commerson on a round-the-world expedition with the French explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville. She became the first known woman to circumnavigate the globe. The sources on Barré are problematic in reliability and at times contradictory, but it is clear that she accompanied Commerson to assist in collecting plants. Commerson had been appointed, at the recommendation of the famous scientist Carl Linnaeus, as botanist for the journey. Jean Barré successfully passed as a man for months, joining Commerson in plant collection and study before being discovered. In 2012, over 200 years after Barré died, botanist Eric Teep of the University of Cincinnati named a new species of nightshade in Barré's honor to recognize her contributions to 18th century botany. Barré was not an isolated example, even if her story was a bit more dramatic than most. Many individuals, men and women, throughout the early modern world of the 17th and 18th centuries had a deep knowledge of plants and their uses. In the Atlantic world of Africa, Europe, and the colonial Americas, for example, enslaved Africans transferred their knowledge of plants to the Americas, Amerindian guides introduced European naturalists to new plants, and midwives used plants when attending childbirths and treating disease. Historians have just begun to recognize the significance of colonial contexts to the exchange of scientific knowledge, uncovering how diverse women and men contributed not only to Enlightenment science, but also to the broader history of empire and imperialism. I will be focusing tonight on one category of contributors to plant knowledge, women associated with the work of the Enlightenment scientist Carl Linnaeus, who revolutionized the study of plants in 18th century Europe through what became known as the Linnaean system. And more on that in a minute. The height of women's participation in Linnaean botany was the mid-18th to the early 19th centuries, when botany was not only considered an appropriate field of study for women, but in some cases became associated as a, quote, feminine science. Women's prominence in the field was short-lived, though. As the historian Anne Steer has noted, with the emergence of modern science in the 19th century, women botanists were increasingly relegated to amateur status as botanophiles. Nonetheless, at the height of their botanical activity in what is sometimes called the long 18th century, from the late 1600s to the early 1800s, women traveled the globe, taught botany to children, created laboratories, and illustrated, wrote, and published botanical books. In exploring their contributions tonight, I will highlight several case studies considering not only these women's individual offerings to the field, but also how their work reflects the narrative of the rise and decline of the female botanist in the Age of Enlightenment. The earliest of the women considered here is Maria Sibylla Marian, whose work later served as an important source of knowledge for Linnaeus. Born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1647, at the end of the Scientific Revolution, Marian was raised among a family of artists and printers who encouraged her artistic talent. As a young girl, Marian painted flowers, but she later became fascinated by caterpillars and how they metamorphosed into moths and butterflies. At age 16, Marian married Johann Andreas Graf, an artist who had learned his trade as her stepfather's pupil. After her marriage, Marian continued to raise and draw plants and caterpillars, using her kitchen as a laboratory. In 1679, a year after the birth of her second daughter, Marian published The Wondrous Transformation of Caterpillars. Between 1675 and 1680, she also made a name for herself as a botanical artist, publishing Blumenbuch, a 3-volume illustrated series on flowers. And you can see in her portrait here not only the image of Marian, but also examples of her work, which the portrait artist included to celebrate Marian's renown. Marian gestures to the plants, symbolizing her interest in the study of botany, while a butterfly, a great passion of hers throughout her life, hovers above the plant. In the 17th century, the field of botany often fell under the umbrella of what might be called natural history, the qualitative and descriptive study of nature and the universe. Marian's botanical work in many ways represents her time. It focused on observation rather than experimentation. At the same time, Marian broke ground in 2 important ways. First, she studied the full life cycle of insects, and she did so while also considering their ecological contexts. In other words, she examined the relationship between animals and plants. Marian published her works during a time when classification was beginning to dominate the study of both botany and entomology. However, while others were looking to classify and distinguish, she was demonstrating how plants and insects fit into a wider natural world. You can see in these images of lilies and tulips from her illustrated collection of flowers, Blumenbuch, for example, that insects remained part of Marian's interests. Second, Marian lived an unconventional life for a 17th century woman. In the early 1680s, she left her unhappy marriage, had a religious conversion experience, and joined a Protestant community in the Netherlands. This radical group, known as the Labadists, after their leader, the French reformer Jean de Lavadie, was what we would today call a religious sect. In some ways, then, Marian was making a retreat from the world. However, the group was supportive of its female adherents' intellectual interests. Indeed, the most prominent female Labadist, Anna-Maria van Schorman, was the first woman to attend a Dutch university and one of the most learned women in all of early modern Europe. Marian eventually left the Labadists' community to move to Amsterdam, but her time there was formative to her interests in botany. In 1699, Marian traveled to Suriname, a Dutch colony on the northeast coast of South America, with her youngest daughter, Dorothea Maria. She spent the next 2 years observing, cataloging, and studying the flora and fauna of Dutch Suriname. To make such a dangerous journey as a woman, let alone in the name of science, was highly unusual for the time. While in Suriname, Marian learned local native names for the plants and described their medicinal uses, often drawing on her conversations with enslaved and indigenous persons about their plant and insect knowledge. One historian, Nathalie Zeeman-Davis, has described Marian's work in Dutch Suriname as ethnographic in nature, again signaling how Marian's focus was on relationships rather than on classification. In 1705, after she returned from Suriname, Marian published Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium, based on the tropical plants and insects that she studied during her travels. This slide depicts just a couple of the rich images from Marian's 1705 book. The pineapple, for example, would have been considered a foreign and exotic fruit to Europeans. Marian also included in her book a number of animals that would have fascinated and intrigued Europeans. And FYI, I'm going to show an image of reptiles on the next slide. Here you can see the caiman trying to protect its eggs from a false coral snake. This is one of the more famous images from her book, and it would have been of great interest to Europeans who, unlike us in Southwest Florida, did not regularly get to see alligators or crocodiles. Marian at one point even thought about publishing an entire book on the reptiles of Suriname, but this book never came to fruition. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Marian directly influenced Carl Linnaeus, one of the most important figures in Enlightenment science. In 1735, the Swedish physician and scientist Carl Linnaeus published the first edition of The System of Nature. This book, over the course of multiple editions published in the mid-18th century, codified the practice of taxonomic classification according to what we today call binomial nomenclature. In this system, the first part of the name, the generic name, identifies the genus to which a species belongs. The second part, the specific name, distinguishes the species within the genus. For example, humans belong to the genus Homo and the species Sapiens, hence Homo sapiens. In naming plants and insects, Linnaeus relied on more than 100 species recorded in Marian's works, thus cementing Marian's place in the history of science. And I did want to briefly touch on orchids here, since they are a focus of FGCU's exhibit. Linnaeus published on orchids as early as 1740. However, given the vast number of orchids, today around 28,000 species and counting, he included surprisingly few, only 62 species, and mostly European ones, in his most famous work on plants, Species Plantarum. As the Linnaean system took root in Enlightenment Europe, it inspired a new generation of botanists. One of these naturalists was Cadwallader Coldin from the Hudson Valley in New York. Coldin had a varied, if checkered, history as a politician, serving as lieutenant governor and later as acting governor of the province of New York. He was also a physician and an avid botanist. In the mid-18th century, he trained his daughter Jane in plant study. Jane Coldin became known as the first woman on either side of the Atlantic to master the Linnaean method of plant nomenclature. She also created a botanic manuscript of around 340 plants that she observed in Ulster County, New York. The manuscript included ink drawings as well as written descriptions, such as the one you can see here. Intellectual networks, which often developed through letter writing, were essential for the sharing of ideas across distance in the Age of Enlightenment. Transatlantic exchanges of letters, and in some cases plants, facilitated the spread of Linnaean knowledge in the 18th century. By the time Jane began studying botany, Cadwallader Coldin had already established an ongoing correspondence with multiple well-known botanists on both sides of the Atlantic, including John Bartram, John Ellis, and Alexander Garden, among others. And these would have been well-known names to 18th century scientific circles. Jane Coldin benefited from her father's connection to these correspondence networks, but she also quickly began to gain a reputation of her own. Over the course of the 1750s, she established herself as the premier female botanist in the American colonies. John Bartram, the Pennsylvania botanist whom Linnaeus once called the greatest natural botanist in the world, corresponded with Coldin. In a letter from 1757, using the speech of a Quaker, he wrote, "Respected friend Jane Coldin, I received thine," meaning her letter, "of October 26, 1756, and read it several times with agreeable satisfaction. Indeed, I am very careful of it, and it keeps company with the choicest correspondence, European letters. The viney plant thee so well describes, I take to be the Dioscorea of Hill and Gronovius," to other contemporary naturalists, "though I never searched the character of the flower so curiously as I find thee hath." Bartram thus placed Coldin on the level of famous European botanists with whom he corresponded. Peter Collinson, a London botanist, also admired Coldin's work, and he wrote Carl Linnaeus directly, describing Coldin as, quote, "perhaps the first lady that has so perfectly studied your system. She deserves to be celebrated." Coldin flourished as a botanist throughout the 1750s, and two of her discoveries were even cited in scientific periodicals. In 1759, at the age of 35, she married Dr. William Farquhar, a widower who belonged to her intellectual network. She died shortly after the birth of her first child, but she left behind her botanic manuscript with its rich documentation of the plant life of the Hudson Valley. By the time of Coldin's death, women's interest in botany was beginning to grow. Botany offered several aspects that made it a popular activity for women, especially of middle and upper classes in 18th century society. For example, it provided a creative outlet. Women illustrated plants and frequently incorporated both plants and other elements of the natural world into needlework, as seen in this sampler by the 14-year-old Sarah Wistar at a Quaker school run by Anne Marsh of Philadelphia. Artistic work, as well as crafting, were taught and encouraged as appropriate and sanctioned activities for middle and upper class girls and women, such as Sarah. Another element of botany that made it suitable for female study was that it could be practiced in domestic settings, such as gardens. As the Linnaean system gained acceptance, though, there remained some concerns about women's practice of it. For example, in his study of plants, Linnaeus had classified botany along a sexual system based on the number and arrangement of male and female reproductive organs. Some critics thought that such a system was improper for women to study. However, in the late 18th century, works by several key figures of the Enlightenment helped to popularize botany for women, making it not only acceptable but also feminizing it as a science associated with and practiced by women. The most prominent of these authors was the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who published a collection of botanical letters addressed to a young woman in the 1770s. The botanist Thomas Martin translated the book into English in 1785, a sign of its impact across national borders. Rousseau wrote his botanical letters for Madame Madeleine de la Serre, who owned an herbarium and botanical library, as a guide for her as she introduced her young daughter to botany. Another important defense of women's study of botany came from the British author Mary Wollstonecraft, who took lessons in flower drawing from the naturalist James Sowerby. In her famous 1792 pamphlet, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is considered a seminal work on women's rights, Wollstonecraft attacked critics who sought to keep women from the study of Linnaean knowledge. Rousseau wrote his book as a series of letters, and it belongs to a larger genre of what is sometimes called the familiar format. This format was particularly popular at the end of the 18th and the early 19th centuries, thus coinciding with the height of women's participation in Linnaean botany. It involved a more intimate form of writing, such as dialogue between individuals or a series of letters among two correspondents. The familiar format was frequently aimed at a readership of women and children, and often intended for educational use in the home or domestic settings. Women rarely learned Latin in the 18th century, and this was problematic for their access to the study of botany, since the scientific literature was Latin-based. Works in the familiar format, however, were written in the vernacular, thus making formerly inaccessible fields of study much more available to women and children. It was through the familiar format, and more broadly the field of educational writing, where women found one of the few avenues to science and authorship in the 18th and 19th centuries. Priscilla Wakefield, whose work is depicted here, offers one example. Wakefield, matriarch of an English Quaker family, published 17 books after turning to writing in the 1790s as a means of added income. These ranged from natural history books to travel literature. She also wrote Reflections on the Present Condition of the Female Sex with Suggestions for Its Improvement in 1798, an early feminist treatise that followed on the heels of Wollstonecraft's A Vindication for the Rights of Woman. Aside from the latter, however, all of Wakefield's literature aimed at an audience of children and young people. Her works joined a substantial collection of female author literature written for children in late 18th century Britain. In 1796, Wakefield published An Introduction to Botany, which introduced children, and specifically girls, to Linnaean knowledge. Her focus was the intersection of natural science, education, and morality. In this respect, she followed a late 18th and early 19th century trend of middle-class women who turned to writing about botany for juvenile audiences, sometimes as a means of income. Maria Edgeworth and Jane Marcet offer two other examples. Edgeworth and Marcet, along with Wakefield, wrote botany books in a familiar format that often centered on a mother or governess teaching botany to her children at home, while at the same time using the study of plants as a vehicle for other cultural and social lessons. These authors filled a niche for juvenile literature aimed at the young woman who was educated privately. Felicia, the fictional epistle writer in Wakefield's An Introduction to Botany, for example, was under the care of her mother, who proposed botany as a subject of study, and a teacher named Mrs. Snellgrove, who supervised her science lessons. While it was not unusual for Enlightenment-era female writers to direct their works toward a female audience, Wakefield chose to list the specific reasons behind her target readership. She noted in her preface that many science books were written in Latin, which precluded girls and young women from reading them. Moreover, English language texts were often prohibitively expensive. She hoped to provide her female readers with an affordable alternative in their native language, one that would allow them to undertake a rational pursuit. She also employed the Linnaean system, calling it, quote, the one universally adopted. Though, as the historian Mary Hilton has pointed out, Wakefield did modify Linnaeus for her young audience, desexualizing the stamens and pistils and describing them instead on the basis of classes and orders. Wakefield's informal educational model, which promoted experiential or hands-on learning, suggests that she was influenced by the pedagogical approach of Mary Wollstonecraft and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These writers shared Wakefield's attentiveness to natural observation and the dialogue between student and teacher. Furthermore, An Introduction to Botany is presented in the style of an epistolary narrative, meaning in a series of letters, which was a popular 18th century genre. Thus, Wakefield's targeted readership, her pedagogy, and her writing style all indicate an engagement with major cultural and intellectual trends in Enlightenment Europe. Two themes especially stand out as essential to Wakefield's goals as a science educator. The first is the usefulness and inherent worth of botany as a subject of inquiry. Wakefield stressed multiple benefits of the study of botany, from promoting health through fresh air and exercise, to providing a rational substitute for what she called some of the trifling, not to say pernicious objects that too frequently occupy the leisure of young ladies of fashionable manners. Second, Wakefield reminded the reader, via Felicia's teacher, Mrs. Snellgrove, that botany's potential should not be relegated to the form of plants or the number of their parts. Rather, the advancement of the science of botany required research into the purposes to which plants were applied. The study of botany for Wakefield offered useful knowledge as well as pleasure, and it combined passion and practicality. Wakefield endorsed the idea that children should enjoy their studies. As she wrote in her preface, quote, "In the important business of forming the human mind, the inclination and pleasure of the pupil should be consulted. In order to render lessons effectual, they should please, and be sought rather as indulgencies than avoided as laborious toils." In creating the character of Felicia, whose very name means felicity or happiness, Wakefield made sure to stress Felicia's fondness for flowers. At the same time, Felicia informed her sister Constance, who was away visiting family, that the study of botany was a serious study, and that Mrs. Snellgrove would not permit her to pass those hours in mere amusement. Felicia needed to master her botany lessons in order to teach Constance through their correspondence. In striking a balance between passion and practicality, Wakefield sent the message that the purpose of tapping into the child's interests was to form her mind. On this point, she echoed Rousseau, who espoused the power of natural curiosity and natural interest as a catalyst for developing a child's mind. One educator who found inspiration from Wakefield's work was the Dublin teacher and author Sarah Hoare, who praised An Introduction to Botany as the first book of the kind I had read on the subject, and I still feel grateful to the author for having rendered a study which had before been considered abstruse and difficult, so pleasant and familiar. In 1825, Hoare published a collection of poetry on botany that introduced a plant of every Linnaean class. She indicated in the preface to her work that she had not only taken her students for nature walks, a common activity among 18th and early 19th century school teachers who favored hands-on learning, but also that she had taken them to the lectures of Dr. Wade, a professor of botany in Dublin. 6 years later, Hoare published the poetry collection on conchology, the study of shells, and botany depicted here. The poems in this collection illustrate well how Hoare's work sought to balance different aspects of the study of botany. Hoare, raised a Quaker, connected botany to spirituality and the divine. In so doing, though, she also invoked early 19th century ideals of Romanticism, especially in suggesting botany's connection to the sublime, a realm of transcendent thoughts and experiences beyond the ordinary to which Romantic-era authors often aspired. She writes of the study of nature, "'Tis holy exercise of mind, most valued by the most refined, and by the heaven-exalted mind, enjoyed with ecstasy." 2 stanzas later, though, she turns her attention from the sublime to an elegiac address of Linnaeus, whose name became Carl von Linné after he was ennobled. "Still may thy lore, O Linné, charm, still with the love of science warm." Hoare's poetry drew considerably on Linnaean knowledge, combining it with the artistic presentation of poetry. As the literary scholar Samantha George has argued, Wakefield, Hoare, and other women who associated botany with art, poetry, and the teaching of young children contributed to the process of botany becoming feminized, to the extent that it became considered unmanly. Simultaneously, though, significant changes were beginning to occur in the history of science that reordered who could practice science and how. As early as the 1790s, commentators began to distinguish between the botanist as a scientist and the botanophile as an enthusiast. The former, the scientist, was increasingly associated with men. As the historian Anne Stier has shown, some botanists during the 1820s even began to create strategies to reclaim botany as masculine science in the eyes of the public. The familiar format of Wakefield and others, which had dominated botanical literature aimed at women, was labeled as feminine and non-science, while new literature emerged for the male scientist that was more technical and specific in nature. Many of these changes can be seen as part of a larger shift in the history of science. As natural history developed into what we now know as modern science, training became more specific, and each of the respective sciences underwent professionalization. In most cases, this process of professionalization also marginalized amateur practitioners, including women and other underrepresented groups in European and American society. This was a widespread phenomenon. In early 19th century medicine, for example, the male doctor increasingly replaced the female midwife as the facilitator of childbirth. But the implications were significant for the field of botany. By the 1830s, women were engaging in the study of botany not as botanists per se, but rather as botanical enthusiasts. This is not to say that women did not continue to study and contribute to the field. Indeed, both male and female writers continued to encourage women to engage in plant study, to grow and illustrate plants, and to share their knowledge of nature with children. Botany continued to be a highly popular pursuit among women, especially educated women. And some 19th century women gained considerable reputation for their knowledge. One notable example is the British children's author Beatrix Potter. While perhaps best known for her Tale of Peter Rabbit, Potter also illustrated fungi, studying them under the microscope and even experimenting with spore germination. But the heyday of women as practitioners of Linnaean knowledge largely ended with the rise of modern science. It would not be until well into the 20th century that women's entrance into the professional study of botany was once again fully welcomed. I've included on this slide a few suggestions for further reading if you are interested in learning more about women in botany in the Age of Enlightenment. And also here is information to the wonderful exhibit that FGCU Archives has curated on the shape of orchids and eternal love affair. It is running through December 3rd, and you can find more information about it as well as a link to donate to the archives on the slide here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bouldin. As always, you're so full of knowledge, and the illustrations were just so beautiful. So thank you for taking time out of your evening to speak with us. If you have any questions for Dr. Bouldin, please do drop them in the chat. We are monitoring them. I do have a couple that have been put in already, if you don't mind. First, Ashrith asks, a light one, Dr. Bouldin, what is your favorite type of plant?
Ooh. I have to say probably orchids. I'm very excited about the exhibit because of that.
And then Viviana asks, would you say that female botanists were as respected as and by male botanists, or were they considered more hobbyists?
Great. Hi, Viviana. So yes, in the brief period of time of the late 18th century, they really were seen as the intellectual equals of the men with whom they were corresponding. But I think by the 19th century, you really see that the professionalization of science is pushing them to the sides. And so even if they are practicing botany, they're not gaining the respect that, that they were in the 18th century. And a good example of that is that they found it more and more difficult to get their contributions into the scientific literature in the 19th century.
Do you find that there were, a question from Dr. Tolhurst as a follow-up, did you find that there were many male botanists who were praising female botanists?
Yes, especially in the correspondence networks from the Age of Enlightenment, you do find that. The one I mentioned, Collinson, who is praising Jane Coldin, he was actually trying to get Linnaeus to name a plant after Jane Coldin. So he was very proud of the work she was doing. Another man in her intellectual network made sure that one of her findings was published in the Royal Magazine, one of the scientific publications. So yes, for that period of time, yes.
Megan asks, is there much discussion about women choosing girls as an audience? Were they covertly teaching them about the joys of research and the importance of science and study?
Yeah, this is something that I have really been enjoying looking into, because you do see some examples of this. I'm currently working on a project on Quaker women educators, and they are often bringing microscopes into the classroom as a way to teach children around the microscope. And that's something that you can see in a couple of different classrooms in the 18th, early 19th centuries, which was really unusual for women at this time to be working with microscopes. You also see a lot of interest in using things like nature walks as a way to introduce science to women in a very acceptable way, but that is also using the scientific rigor of the Linnaean method. So yeah, there were all sorts of ways that these girls' schools especially were kind of getting around some of the strictures to encourage scientific study.
I have Beth asking, can you talk more about the process of the professionalization of science? What drove that? Any insights into why women were squeezed out of that realm?
Yeah. So botany is in some ways part of a much larger picture of the rise of modern science. So in the before, say, the 18th century, there was the study of natural history, which was the observation of science, and the study of natural philosophy, which was interested in things like experimentation. But in the sort of post-Enlightenment age, those two combined into modern science using the modern scientific method. and increasingly sciences were becoming much more laboratory focused, much more experimental. And a lot of this was seen as just really not, first of all, appropriate for, there was sort of seen as a danger in women experimenting to a certain extent. But there was also this sense of an increased idea of professionalization. So men were going to universities to study science, and universities were largely the domain of men. So as things became increasingly professional in the sense of someone needing a degree and formal training to practice science, increasingly that left women out of the picture. And so for the 19th century, we really see a sort of nadir in women's participation in science. While there were some women who did obviously gain fame, I mean, certainly in the early 20th century, for example, Marie Curie, this was a period of more limited activity in a lot of ways for women scientists.
And a nice follow-up to that, Dr. Tolhurst asked, were there any female botanists overtly or deliberately subversive of the male-dominated system?
That is an interesting question. I guess I wouldn't say subversive of the system in the sense that they're trying to overthrow it. It's hard to say sometimes with women from this time period who are finding agency, whether they are trying to work within the confines and would like to go further and maybe can't. But most of the women I've looked at, for example, Priscilla Wakefield, Mary Wollstonecraft, who are making arguments for women's participation in botany, are doing so through what we would probably call like proto-feminist terms, meaning they're making the argument that their study will benefit everyone, but they're not making the claims on the basis of as women, they deserve this right to be studied.
Melissa asks, botany and natural theology were closely associated in the Victorian age. When did you see a separation begin?
Yeah. Really, that's something that's going to continue in, and especially in more amateur settings for quite some time. And so in the 19th century, you have this interesting overlap between amateur practice and more professional practice, which is moving away from natural theology, but amateur practice really continuing it in a lot of ways. And some of the most active groups that are interested in the connection between botany and natural theology, such as the Unitarians and the Quakers, are practicing it more as amateurs, but very intensely throughout the 19th century.
And then Ashrith asks, where do these plants come from, since those plants are new to me, and how were they discovered? Kind of following into these were amateurs and these plants are wild.
Yes, yes. So it's interesting to think about this age, right? Because in the 18th century, we're starting to see a lot of people traveling the globe for the first time, and in the context of especially 18th century botanists, European botanists, there's an imperial context to plant collection. So they're going to other regions of the world as imperialists to study and classify and collect plants, which has all sorts of implications for sort of how they're using other people's in that process. But because of that, they become very interested in the exotic. And so some of the more exotic plants that they see as exotic that would not have been available to them in Europe. So a good example of that is Linnaeus, who's focused in the mid 18th century almost entirely on European orchids, but by the 19th century, they're really trying to figure out how to bring greenhouses into Europe to grow and cultivate a lot more species of orchids.
Then Bailey asks, were there any female botanists that you found in your studies who were also suffragists? A throwback to our Fight for the Ballot exhibition.
No, so I haven't come across any suffragists, but I guess I would say that Wollstonecraft is very important. She studied with the botanical illustrator, James Sowerby, and took a real interest in plants, and it's really seen, I think, especially her 1792 work as the seminal work for what evolves into eventually into calls for feminism. So really important connection to the suffragists.
And there's just so many cool women doing a lot of really cool things, and botany just seems women in botany seems so niche. What encouraged your interest in the history of women in botany?
Yeah, so it's part of a larger project I'm working on Quaker women educators and their connection to the Enlightenment. So I'm interested in the way that these educators were in many ways engaging in very significant ways with Enlightenment discourses, not only connected to science, but also to things like bringing it into the slave trade, to all sorts of areas of study in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And so as these women were engaging in this, I started to notice a lot of Quaker botanists and Quaker science educators. So that's how I first came to the project. But once I did and was trying to place them in this larger picture, I realized just how many women there were and how networked they were to male botanists at the time and to other intellectual networks.
Sharon asks, what is it about orchids that causes such a great fascination by so many people?
What a great existential question. Yes. Yes. And if you haven't had a chance to visit, really incredible orchids currently at the exhibit, yes.
And I am really interested. Oh, Viviana has another one. What is the overlap of religion and botany during this time? Was there a significance, or was it more of a coincidence, thinking about Quaker women educators promoting that subject?
Yeah. Well, I can mostly speak to the Quaker context here, since that's the one I'm most familiar with. Quakers saw botany and science in general, the natural sciences that would focus especially on like observation in the natural world, as very connected to their theology, which emphasized experience and observation and was very connected to the natural world. So they saw the practice of botany as almost a religious experience, connecting them to God. So they drew very close ties in that. And those ties are really what's in many cases driving their study. I think Unitarians I've done less work on them, but they shared some of those interests in observation and the connection to the divine. So certainly that is driving a lot of the more religious aspects at this time.
A nice follow-up question to that from Beth. Do you consider this study separate from using herbs as healing, or is that part of the botanical study in history?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the Enlightenment is that it's trying to move away somewhat in the formal Linnaean knowledge from the application of plants. They're really only interested in classification. But what's making female botanists a little bit different is that many of them are also arguing that botany should be something that continues to focus on application. Priscilla Wakefield, who I mentioned, is an example of that. She wants to make sure children are learning about the medicinal uses of plants, for example. So some of these women are continuing traditions that would have been very familiar to them, as the female healer had a significant place in European society for many years. And of course, women had great plant knowledge that was applied to, for example, their work as midwives, or their work as healers in local communities. And so that condition, that situation really does transfer over to the Linnaean botanist who's a woman in the 18th century, much more than it is to male Linnaean botanists who are starting to leave that behind.
And one question I had, going back a little bit to teaching, when do you see female botanists formally teaching?
Yeah.
At large, at least.
Right. So they're mostly teaching children, not in university settings or older men or older boys. They're mostly teaching young children. A lot of times they're teaching girls, and they're teaching them both in schools, so what we would call primary schools, as well as in the home, as either governesses or mothers or teachers in private settings. And that's really continuing throughout the 18th and into the 19th centuries. So that's something that really is a little less, I think, changing over time. It's more stable.
And Viviana asks, you touched on travel. Were botanical excursions, including women, common, or was that frowned upon?
Yeah, so the excursions that Maria, Sybil, and Marian makes are really extraordinary. And that would have been highly unusual, especially in the early 18th century. I think if you're thinking about by the sort of mid to late 18th century, it was much more common for women to be traveling a bit more. So that maybe less so, but her travels, especially to Suriname alone with her daughter in 1699 was really extraordinary. Yeah.
And Melissa asks, do you see a correlation between the current movement of growing food, organic food, to their views of healing?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question. There's some great work being done on something called kitchen gardens, which is something that many 18th century women kept, especially in colonial America, where they would have quite literally right outside their kitchens. And kitchens at this time were separate from the other parts of the house. So they would keep a garden with all sorts of herbs, and it's also vegetables, fruits that they would grow for their family, but also for healing purposes. And that has, I think in some ways, some historians are starting to study these to see the connections to more modern concepts of growing food and how that's coming back into our lives in this more modern movement. And the kitchen gardens are really a connection point for that.
Bruce asks, what are your thoughts on women in botany today?
Yeah. So I know obviously a lot more as a historian about the 18th century than I do today, but I have to say that I was really inspired in college by a female botany professor who I had the pleasure of studying with. So I am really happy that that women botanists are still out there practicing the craft, much more welcomed and accepted into the scientific academy now. Yes.
And Deborah asks, have you considered expanding application, traditions, and knowledge to Native American plant uses and the transition to white female contributors?
Yeah. So this is one of the newer and really exciting areas of study. And I'll go back to if I go back to this slide here, I think you can see the work by Susan Scott Parrish on American Curiosity has been one of the first major works to address this and to think about botany more in an imperial context and to consider especially the contributions of Indigenous persons in North America to natural history and botany. And her work has really broken ground on that, and that's something that's continuing to be considered because one of the things that often happened in the 18th century was that Indigenous persons, as well as enslaved Africans in some cases, are sharing this knowledge, tremendous knowledge that then gets appropriated, put into this Linnaean system, and their contributions are unrecognized. So that's a newer area of study, but a very important one.
Bailey asks, who has been your favorite female botanist to study so far?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard question. So, well, I think that Jeanne Barré is really fascinating, but we don't know as much about her because a lot of the sources on her are not as reliable. I really think that Jane Coldin is amazing in the work she did, and her manuscript was for many years just sort of sitting in this archive, and so she's just in the past few years regained interest among historians, and I hope that we'll see more about her in coming years.
And we have a few more minutes. If anyone has any more questions, they can go ahead and drop them in the chat. Again, thank you so much for your time. These are really fantastic questions. So they're hard hitters, but I just love learning so much about this. I'll give it a few more seconds. And as we're starting to wrap up, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more information about the book you're working on and when we can maybe anticipate seeing it.
Sure, yeah. So I'm working on a book called Quaker Women Educators in the Age of Reason, and Teachers of the Light, Quaker Women Educators in the Age of Reason. And this is a book that is exploring the intersection between the Enlightenment and Quaker women and how they used the classroom and education more broadly as a way to really shape the discourses of the Enlightenment surrounding everything from ideas about civility to ideas about the slave trade, certainly science, education, looking at also at their contribution to early children's literature and the ways they're thinking about their engagement with reason, which is so important to the Enlightenment. So I am currently finishing up the research for that, and hopefully the book will be out in a couple of years.
Thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I wanted to thank everybody for coming and hearing Dr. Bouldin speak on these fantastic women. And thank you, Dr. Bouldin, for giving us some of your time this evening. Please do come see Cultivators of Knowledge, Women, the Study of Botany on Digital FGCU if you want to revisit any of this fantastic information or see any of these sources. It will be up on Digital FGCU in the coming days. And please do come visit The Shape of Orchids, an Eternal Love Affair on the 3rd floor of the library until December 3rd.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Kaylee, I think I've given you back my screen.